Hey, everybody. Welcome to Althing Considered. It is 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I think about 2 o'clock a.m. Over our friends in the Universal Coordinated Time. So it's time for All Things Considered. As you know, Friday night. Let's get it. Right now, we are going to have a wonderful topic this evening. And I've got two wonderful guests. Wait, we don't just have one guest. We have two guests. Wait. Tonight's guests, plural. So tonight, friend of the show, Sarenth is here. Hey, Sarenth, how's it going?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me.
And we also have a newcomer to the show. First time, hopefully not last time. Hrabnas is also here as well. Hello, Hrabnas.
Nice to see everyone tonight.
Great. So my name is Ben Kowalski. I am just as usual, just happy to be here. I'm the communications director for the Troth. That's why I get to be here, talking to these wonderful guests about a really wonderful topic, which is going about children's stories, the lost art of making stuff up for the kids. As it were, we're also probably going to end up talking about making stuff up in general, and how sometimes we do need to give ourselves permission to make stuff up, and what that consists of. So I actually do want to get into our guests to talk about their expertise, their backgrounds. So I'm going to go with friend of the show first, Sarenth.
Hey, beautiful people. So do you want me to just go ahead and dive right on in?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So for me, a lot of when I consider, what is making things for the kids.
Oh, wait, Sarah. I would more like dive in of like your background.
Sorry, I was really excited for tonight's episode.
No, you're champion. You're champion at that bit. I hear you.
All right.
I love it. Love the energy.
I am the co-host of Around Grandfather Fire, which is a podcast exploring spirituality, polytheism, animism, and all things in between, as well as pop culture and science, and anything that our religions touch. So that is my podcast. You can find us on Around Grandfather Fire, wherever you find your podcasts. You could also find me on Three Pagans on Tap with Malik Odinson. And we do a monthly YouTube live show with that. With Around Grandfather Fire, I co-host with Cabra, Snow, and Emily Streaking Fate. And have a lovely time with both of these shows. We explore a lot of different topics on both the shows. We are going to be having Mortellus on Around Grandfather Fire. So that is one of my primary things that I am most concerned and happy to talk about. As far as myself, I'm a heathen spirit worker, which means that while I do have a grounding in the lore, a lot of my relationships with various gods, ancestors, and Vetir, that I call collectively the Genregen, is very much spirit-driven, spirit-based, and so a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight is from that perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And if anyone hasn't heard Around Grandfather Fire yet, I will say it is wonderful conversations and the most relaxing introduction to a podcast in all of heathenry or paganism. Generally, the podcast introductions are kind of hype, like the one here. This is just, it's smooth. Like you feel so cozy by the end of it. It's awesome. Love it. Hrabnas, tell us about yourself.
So I'm also a member of the Troth, solo practitioner within the Troth in my region, but I also take part with a local inclusive kindred, the Northfire kindred. I tend to be more of a continental Germanic practitioner rather than Norse practitioner, which means I have less direct lore to work with. So when it comes for bringing my son into the practice, I have to do a lot of this making up. And actually, one thing I wrote a book specifically from my stories I've written for him, and hopefully going to keep producing like more stories. So this is kind of, this topic in particular is something I'm pretty passionate about. I'm very much into adapting the Norse lore to more of a Proto-Germanic, early Germanic vibe, given my lack of just non-Roman source material.
Yeah.
And with that, Also just a lot of making it up, a lot of scholarly research. As opposed to the spirit work that Sarenth does, I do a lot more of the digging and scholarly side and lore side, just because I have that whole foundation I still need to build before I can even get up to that level that Sarenth kind of operates at.
I am going to have to ask you the big question that's always gotten me in trouble, because you mentioned about, you know, you've done some recreated and retelling of Norse lore into a more Proto-Germanic vibe, and my question is like my question that usually starts like, what are the main differences that you note between Proto-Germanic vibe versus Norse vibe? So we're definitely getting into those questions, and maybe we'll actually start with that one, just to you when you're recreating stories. So you're saying you're taking stories from a say like from a Norse perspective, from like a Saxo or a Snorri, although we all know Saxo was correct. What's the no, I will die on the hill. What's the kind of translation you do to get it into more of a continental Proto-Germanic kind of feel?
With me, especially leaning towards like the very early Germanic, by the time of Norse society, when it comes to the stages of Germanic, like classical to medieval society, Norse society is very refined by that point. Is a good way to think of it. There's a lot of refinement of a lot of traditions already to their stories that built up. I kind of dial that back. I take a lot of inspiration from um, a lot of traditional oral storytelling societies, even some from the earlier scholarly translations of even the early Old Testament, because those were Bronze Age oral stories originally. Earlier Eastern stories. We have a good friend who I use as a great resource, and she's helped me a lot with a lot of organizing information for tonight. She is a Waganakasing Odawa woman, and I've bounced a lot of her about their oral traditions from an early perspective. Obviously, just from the more open perspective, nothing closed practice, but it lets me sort of pull it back to that more primal feel, and then etymologically, um, taking a lot of the names, a lot of common terms that I'm using, especially if I'm trying to build alliteration, pulling it back to Proto-Germanic, as opposed to having more of a Norse feel. Because for everyone else, we're all familiar with Odin, Othin, but pulling that back even just in a story to the name Wodenas, or using Ingwaz instead of Freyr, or Thunras instead of Thor, just invoking those names already begins to pull that feel back. It's a lot of UPG, unverified personal gnosis, for those who aren't familiar with that term. But sometimes, like with the theme of what we're doing tonight, you just have to make stuff up. We don't have that unbroken lineage of tradition that some others may have. It's making it up is just naturally going to be a part of this.
Yeah, and it's not like people who are steeped in the Norse sources are going to be in any better of a position necessarily than, well, maybe somewhat of a better position than someone who's got Proto-Germanic or who's looking at continental sources. I know there's more, but it's not from the perspective of an unbroken lineage.
Right.
We're all level same. It's all the break happens somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Sarenth, if we're also thinking about, just thinking from Hrabnas's comment about like drawing Norse sources back, have you ever had it where you're looking at a modern, where you're looking at modern storytelling, when you're looking at modern stories that sometimes we tell our kids, modern fairy tales? Do you ever find yourself drawing back or pulling back, or do you ever find yourself taking a modern story and drawing it back into, say, like an old Norse tale?
So sometimes, so we commonly will talk about, the tooth fairy, right? So I treat the tooth fairy as if it is in some way, shape, or form real. So when she says, I'm putting this tooth in the pillow for the tooth fairy, I go, okay. As somebody that does not care to work with fairies very often, I kind of smile, I nod and go, okay. And I play along with it. Not because, this isn't for me, this isn't just indulging in childhood whimsy, but this is also like a teaching moment for her with spirits. Because if you give something, you need to get something. So even if it's something where, yes, daddy is going to go get the $5 to help with the exchange, I am still treating this with her as a very real spiritual thing where she is giving a gift and she's expecting something in return. I just happen to be the person being the medium for it.
I forgot to put up the content warning here, guys. We might be busting a few myths to see. So if you are out there, kids, turn it off. Earmuffs. He doesn't go get the money. He doesn't go get the money.
Well, the thing is, if she ever caught me doing it,
yeah,
I would have explained to her, like, it's not that the fairies aren't real. It's that they're not physical.
Yeah.
At least these ones aren't. And so for me, like, leaving that leeway out also, for me is important because I'm not going to fight with science on physical reality. I'm just not. Like, I very much believe that science is a very excellent indicator of how the world works. And she can clearly see that, there's a correlation going on here. But what I'm trying to get at when I'm taking the tooth fairy myth and doing what I do, if she ever did catch me doing it, which, eventually maybe she'll see this broadcast. Sorry, sweetie. What I don't want to do is I don't want to do what happens to a lot of kids when, trigger warning for all the kids out there who still believe in Santa Claus. When they find out that the way that people commonly teach that Santa Claus isn't real, it hurts them because they're feeling lied to.
Yeah.
And for me, it's really important that if we play into these modern ideas and modern tropes, that they are couched in ways that we're not lying to our kids, but also that they're couched in ways that also don't really break our own ontology, right? Because what we want to do is we want to carry these traditions on, and you can't do that if you're making your children feel lied to. Well, if they lied to me about this, what else have they lied to me about? So sometimes I get a bit judicious on what I do and don't play into when it comes to holidays, whether it's Santa Claus or whether it's modern myths like the Tooth Fairy. How I work with those is something I think very carefully about, and I talk with my family about, partly because I want to be on the same page, but also because I don't want to undermine the hard work of teaching these kids, hey, we want to be in right relationship with these gods, ancestors, and Vetir, spirits, and then kind of undermine that by, well, some of them are real, but some of them aren't, and we're just going to treat these ones as though they're real, and it muddies waters we don't need to be muddying. So when it comes to making things in the modern age, I ask people to really think through what you're doing and why you're doing it, because these can have incredible effects on people's lives. And it might seem really simple to us.
Yes. I do want to acknowledge something that came in the chat from while you're speaking about Count Howdy, asked a really big question about what our thoughts are about our faith being hijacked by people promoting racist ideology. I think we'll save that question for the end. Howdy, we're just because we're talking about kid stories right now, it might tie in later because as there are stories we don't want to tell our kids and stories we don't want our kids to hear and narratives that we don't want them to hear. So or get involved with. So absolutely, I don't want to ignore the question or dodge it. It's just gonna have to come up later towards the end of the show. But thanks for the question. So, Sarenth, I appreciate what you're saying about the notion of what's our intention with telling these stories, and is it our attention to the intention for me for telling my daughter about how Santa Claus works, how the Julenisse works. For one, I have informed her that there is not one Santa Claus. There are many, like an army of, and that the people who dress as Santa, they are putting on a costume, but they do it because they love Santa so much, and they like making people happy because they know Santa makes people happy, so they like putting on the suit and pretending to be Santa because it's part of the the spirit of the season is dressing up, just like you dress up for Halloween, just like you dress, but these people do it. Some special people like to dress up like Santa because they really like Santa.
Mm-hmm.
Hrabnas, I want to throw it over to you too. Is intention behind like what it is we're trying to do by telling these, let's just call them myths or legends, or I don't know, framing stories, we might say, to our kids. What role do you think intentionality plays in that?
Well, the intention is the foundation of why the story is existing in the first place. I actually, that woman who's a close family friend I talked about, the Odawa woman, we sat, we actually had a whole conversation about this and just the basics of stories. And the first thing that we were hitting on in our conversation was, of these priorities, is why are you telling the story? Is it for establishing a history of your tradition, a history of your lore? Are you trying to teach a lesson? Are you trying to establish a tradition? That intention, that reason is the entire first layer before you even build up into everything else.
Yeah, going into the tooth fairy example you gave, Sarenth, about it being a fundamental example of the gift for trying to get someone into the idea of a gift for a gift, right? Of the relationship one has with the surrounding spirits of place. It might not be the tooth fairy, but it's showing by demonstration the idea of, and also I think here's another thing, Sarah. Another thing is I think this is rather clever. It's also teaching the notion of not everything that you think, because who wants a tooth? Honestly, who wants?
Right.
Who's like? Okay, maybe there are some teeth collectors out there. I'm no shade on you guys who collect teeth. Actually, I don't know. It'd be a little weird if I walked into someone's house and there's a tooth collection.
I'm a guy who enjoys collecting various animal parts and skulls. So, like, to me, it's teeth? Like, okay.
But what if it was like human? I don't know. I don't know if I walked into
everybody's got their thing.
I know. All right, everyone's. I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to judge.
I will not yuck your yum, even if I don't understand it.
Yeah, I'm not going to yuck your yum. Human teeth collectors.
Take me out, man.
That's a phrase I never thought I'd say in my life. So, but the idea of I don't want to say like disproportionate gifts, but like you might not understand why it is that a tooth is valuable, and it's the idea of you giving it that's valuable.
So it's actually a perfect time to tell the story of why the gift of a tooth is so important. So this is a way to introduce soul lore at a very young age.
Yeah.
And if you understand that your body is one of the souls, you are giving a piece of your soul to somebody. And that takes on some really interesting implications for everybody that's been giving the tooth fairy their teeth for years. I'm sorry if I just blew your mind with a little bit of existentialism, but if you think of giving physical gifts from your body to other people, you are literally giving in you can call it likr, you can call it hama, depends on your perspective and what soul lore map you're working with. Heavily recommend heathensoulllore.net for folks who are interested in this, but that's Winifred Hodge Rose's website. She's amazing. With this understanding, this basic understanding of your body has value, you instill that understanding of value in your child's body, that you don't give these things away willy-nilly, that you have a right to expect gift for a gift when it's a gift literally of yourself. So a lot of actual lessons get tied into, okay, do you understand why we let you do this and what this means? And exploring that with my children has been fun because you see the gears start turning and they get it.
Matt, what way, Hrabnas, I wanted to ask to turn this over to you. I mean, what ways do we not just tell the stories, but like develop these kind of mini rituals And what kinds of things have you come up with, like to show those passages of the Tooth Fairy, the marking of time, the marking of the years? I really like how you're tying it in with the soul lore, Sarenth. What have you found in your own practice?
My practice is also a little bit unique, and this is actually something that'll come up in a later week, so I won't delve too heavily into it now. But my situation is of an interfaith family. My wife is Christian and I am pagan. So there's a lot of middle ground where my son is being introduced to both sides of this. Um, so very much to the traditional Judeo-Christian calendar of that passage of time, but I'll also specifically take him out um, bloats and rituals on the equinoxes, solstices, and my specific calendar. So he's going to have a very unique perspective coming up from that aspect of it. And when it comes down to the stories, um, he's only 7 years old, so it's only very recently that he's really been exposed to a lot. But he will actually take walks with me in the woods, and I'll just tell him stories, either from the Norse lore that I just kind of pull the names back to the Proto-Germanic names that I use, or some of the stories that I've written that I've memorized. Actually, we had a very good conversation. The last time we walked, we still had snow here. It's all melted since, but we were walking along the lakeshore, and I actually started telling him about the Bronze Age creation myth from the Germanic perspective about Yumyaz Ymir and the creation of the realms and the world. And then he was interested in that and wanted to know some other things. And I actually as far as taking a story that is very much not child friendly and having to pare it down into a way that is child friendly, a Proto-Germanic telling of the Locusena. And the
I was gonna
ruining, yes,
yeah,
the
this
ruining
is actually
of the party at 8 years old. And I will admit, in that story, I am not unbiased. I tend to venerate Tiwaz or Tyr. So, or a certain degree of order and civility and justice is just a part of my practice. I tend to be and no shade to Loki practitioners out there at all. I have nothing personal against you, but from my perspective and my practice, I am very anti-Loki in that story. I am not forgiving of his actions and how he carries on, and that kind of bled into my telling of him about, and that story rolled into social propriety about the right time and place to bring up somebody's faults or secrets or something like that. And it fell into that lesson I want for him. It's like, you can have beef with people, you can have issues with people or no secrets about them, but there is a time and place to bring those things up, or to know not to bring them up. There's a certain order to be kept. So we can still use those stories even in ways they weren't initially intended to be used, to teach certain social lessons.
This is part of the next question that I wanted to go to. Is one of your earlier points about how stories, you find them. So I'm going through with my daughter and trying to tell her Norse stories and go Norse myths, right? And I'm trying to find one where it's like, oh yeah, this is a good one for kids. Oh wait, nope, there's a slaughter. Oh wait, nope, this one has sexual assault in it. Nope, this one has more murder. Nope, this one has incest in it. Like, just can't tell that. And so you as parents, we constantly run into these challenges. And I feel like some of it, I don't know, some of it for me is almost, I think, inherited a little bit from my Christian past, even though I didn't have much of one to speak of. But the idea that you're supposed to tell your child religious stories, that's something, like, if you have a religion, you are supposed to tell them the stories as they were, right? You're supposed to tell them about this and this and this. Unedited. You're supposed to tell them the truth. But that just, I couldn't bring myself to do it. And so that's where I found myself sitting there making stuff up, like about how she doesn't need to be scared of thunderstorms because that's just Thor pressing rain out of the clouds, which is not in the lore. That is not in the lore at all. But it helps her overcome her fear of thunder, and it's actually a nice way to introduce how the gods help us. And now she's actually excited for thunderstorms now. But it's that impetus of like, I really don't have a lot of stories to tell about Thor or any of the gods that are 100% like appropriate for a 4-year-old. So when did you guys hit that wall, and what did you do?
Well, first, let me show you. I spent only about maybe 5 to 10 minutes while eating dinner tonight, tabbing out various things in the books. These are all points that I would not want to bring up with my son. Either points of sexual violence, just inappropriate for his age. And this was just a matter of a few minutes. This is from the existing sources, this is a legitimate challenge. And it's not necessarily that given a situation, children cannot be brought to understand the context of those passages. But we live in the paradise that our ancestors wanted. Plentiful fields, for the most part, peace. We're not being raided all the time from our neighbors, and all that. Our children don't have to experience that. Eventually, they'll be old enough to read through it and be able to take it in context. But it's not at a point where they have to know about this for their own safety or to explain something that they're seeing on a daily basis. So those stories, there's still lessons in them, but it can be very difficult to parse them out in a way that is appropriate for a modern child.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarenth, but one thing I did want to touch on before it left my brain was about like sagas, right? Like different ways to teach kids about saga literature, or to tell anybody about saga literature. The one thing that I usually see people teach sagas is about like the feud, like the centrality of a feud, and why like it's so important to get vengeance on somebody. If they do, if they hurt your family, you need to get this and this and this. And I reread the sagas, these usually, multi-generational narratives of violence, and and what I see is, well, what I'm seeing here is, if these people engaging in violence in the past knew what they were going to visit upon their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren by engaging in a cycle, by beginning a cycle of violence that would claim all of them throughout those generations, would they not have chosen differently, or would they not have chosen differently, knowing that the violence that they enact today will absolutely be visited on their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, who would all die as a result of it? That's where I see like maybe we want to call it modern perspective creeping into a retelling of a story, of saying like, well, look, no, the point is not to be so quick to take vengeance. But Sarenth, we were just talking about like these retellings of how to make stories that aren't so nice. What do we do with them?
So it depends. When it comes to some of those sagas, I think what a lot of people miss is how many people are praised for their ability to be peacemakers in between these really dramatic family sagas. You will occasionally have someone the old, or someone somebody who's really, really renowned for being a peacemaker, but they don't make a really good story because, for one, context, right? We're talking about skaldic texts, which were usually written for rich guys or for the entertainment of a hall, and violence sells, turns out. So when we're deciding what to emphasize in the sagas, like the question of is this age appropriate is a great one, but I think the question can also be flipped on its head. What stories are often left out because of the context in which they're being told?
Yeah.
So these aren't stories for kids. None of these are. And so for me, recontextualizing the myths is fine, but there's certain times where I leave the myths to speak for themselves. And I straight up say, when we tell the creation story, I talk about Ymir being slaughtered. And for me, the reason I leave that in is because the parting of Ymir's body and becoming Yorth from it is actually really key to getting them to understand that the ground beneath your feet, the sky above you, we're all related to it. And it was a sacrifice. And so for me, I don't actually edit some of the stories. I leave them as they are, and I let them wrestle with the violence, because they are all entering a society where, unfortunately, at some point or another, they're going to have to decide how they feel about violence. And from my perspective, I feel that introducing these lessons earlier is more useful, because kids will have violence visited upon them, and how they react to being hurt is important. And so with some of these sagas, take the opposite lesson, kid. So we have two books that I like to reference for when we're doing story time, and that's Dowler's Book of Norse Myths and Norse Mythology for Kids, which was put out by Dr. Nordvig. And the stories are approachable, but I find that the way that they tell the stories is not sanitized to the point of, well, and then Ymir walked over the hills and that was it. It still leaves the important stuff in that, for me, I use as a foundational, pardon the pun, foundational story for bringing important lessons about relating to the world around us. And there are certain parts of the story that I don't emphasize as much as I do others, but I think that this is part of having a living religion, as opposed to, we're going to read from the book today. And so it's not just that we're dialoguing with the sagas or with the myths. We're dialoguing with our gods, our ancestors, our Vatir, and our kids. And we're dialoguing with ourselves, because what lesson do I want to impart? The recontextualization of myth as you're telling it is part of living myth, because this is not mythology, which is the study of myth. This is the giving of a story.
Yes.
What are you giving this kid through the story? That, for me, when I'm telling my child a story, either of my children a story, it is always in the forefront of my head of, what is this meant to teach? What is this meant to foster? One of the things that you brought up earlier, which I thought was great, was talking about how when Thor travels through the skies, he's squeezing out the raindrops. I have a similar story I tell my kids, where Thor might be fighting with giants today, but tomorrow he may be partying with them. Kind of bringing in the sagas and the myths on the one hand of, yes, Thor does go to war with some giants, some Jotnar, but on the other hand, he doesn't fight with all of them. And he gets along with some of them very well. So from my perspective, having a balance between the lesson and telling truthfully is important, but even more so, what relationships are you bringing to the table when you tell these stories? Because what I want the kids to get from telling the creation story is that we relate to the elements of the worlds in a relational way, that the earth beneath their feet is both a slaughtered god and a goddess, and that sacrifice has deep meaning. And so if we choose to put something in our bodies, we need to consider what that means. Just as much as giving a tooth is a consideration of your soul, eating other people's bodies is the consumption of their souls on a very real level. And I do actually have this dialogue with my daughter, and it's really cool and profound to watch her work through that, because we're in an interconnected cycle. So I tell a lot of these stories with that understanding in mind, that Gabo is at the root of everything. That gift for a gift is everything, because what you give the earth today determines whether the crops grow tomorrow.
Yeah. I I think that's a really brilliant take on emphasizing the central principle. So for you, Hrabnas, you were talking earlier about the locusena. The principle that you wanted to emphasize was about social order, and the principle that Sarenth, when you're retelling the myth, the creation story, your emphasis is on the gebo, the idea of that it is all a gift. That is all. I think those are both beautiful stories. One thing I did want to touch on was picking. So the difficult touchy set, because you had touched on Hrabnas before about positioning Loki in that antagonist role, and really doubling down on he is the antagonist here. And I would agree that in Locusena,
in Locusena, he absolutely is. And I am pro Loki.
Yes,
he is the antagonist. You are definitely you ain't telling any tales out of school. But there's also ways of telling. So how do you choose if we're choosing to retell? How do we choose our antagonists, and why do we choose the antagonists we choose? What is it that they're doing? So Hrabnas, I'm gonna pitch it to you, because you took that Loki antagonism and you kept it, whereas I've seen other people in their retellings of Locusena remove that fundamental antagonism. Doesn't make the story as interesting. It makes it interesting in different ways, but it's not that typical flighting that you see, and the stakes are a little bit lower. But for you, how do you decide as to where to place that antagonism? And is it something about what that antagonist is doing, or how do you do that?
Some of this really rolls into actually the second page of notes I just turned on to, because there were a number of things that Sarenth hit on, actually verbatim I had written here, that this also plays into. Is first and foremost with any story is you think about the audience. Your first priority, the story is just the tool in which you are teaching the audience whatever it is you're trying to teach. And one of the first things about that is appropriateness. Not necessarily appropriateness like, oh, is this socially okay to teach? But the appropriateness to the story. Who is the protagonist to this? Who's the appropriate protagonist? Who's the appropriate antagonist to teach the lesson that I'm trying to teach? And as far as using the Locusena to teach social order and everything like that, absolutely. Casting Loki in the antagonist role is appropriate to that. Now, if you were to spin it to say that the story was about the consequences of broken promises, let's say Odin taking a drink without Loki, even though he had made the oath that he had, it would not be appropriate to cast Loki in the role of the antagonist, because that would not be appropriate to the lesson you're trying to teach. It all comes down to what you're trying to teach the audience at that point.
Can I just say, I really deeply appreciate, as somebody who is very pro-tier on your perspective, how you could reach across the aisle like that and provide nuance. I love this. I love that we can get wildly different experiences with our own stories, and that you are willing to consider the other's perspective. That is incredibly refreshing. Thank you.
Well, a big part of that is, as a Tyrian, it would not be fair for me not to show that perspective. So that is a foundational part of sort of the judicious part of my practice. I have to back. Now, the fact that he killed the servant because the servant was being praised, I cannot back him at all. But but I can see where there was a little bit of the grievance on Loki's part because of the broken promise. I don't think it balances out the rest of the story, but I do acknowledge that is there.
Yeah. At that point, it becomes a very different kind of comedy, right? It becomes a comedy of two guys arguing about being offended about something. Like, it's a different story, right? At that point, I think it becomes much more of a comedy, even though I think the Locusena is kind of meant to be a comedy. Kind of has a very comic feel to it, where everything's very exaggerated. I don't know how in seriousness you can talk about Njord getting peed on, in like, and not have it not be a comic, like a comic exaggeration. And that's the least of things.
That's
the least of things,
right here.
Yeah. Look, he was doing it because he's peaceful, guys. He just didn't want, because that was what he was making fun of. He was making fun of Nord for being such a pacifist that he lets people pee on him.
Well, let's not kink shame Nord.
No, it's not kink. It's totally. It is. That's a different story. So if you're just dragging out Nord's dirty laundry, which would be pretty dirty if tales are true.
One thing that I kind of want to so we've talked a lot about stories that are very established. So one of the things that I tell, and it's kind of a story, and it's kind of based in the stories, but it's very much a thing that I've brought forward, is a fire prayer. And we say this before we light sacred fires, before we light candles, things like that. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to do it and demonstrate through the telling of the prayer what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Hail, sons and daughters of Muspelheim, hail fire itself. Hail, eldest ancestor. Hail Suna, hail Loki, hail Glut, hail Logi, hail Surt, hail Sinmora. Hail Mikkel Eldevator, hail Eldevator. Hail, eldest ancestor. Thus do heil. And I'm teaching a lot of god names, and I'm teaching a way of relating to fire. I am also teaching fire safety through the way that I treat fire as I'm lighting it with my kids.
Hail Smokey, guardian bear of the flame.
And, honestly, if you want to incorporate cute stuff like that, that's totally legitimate. Yeah. And it's a great way to use the fire prayer, because you can insert as many different fire gods or as few fire gods as you wish. But I include Eldervator, which is literally translates to fire spirit. And then I include Mikkel Eldervator, which is great fire spirit or big fire spirit. And I relate to the eldest ancestor as fire itself. Now, you can see that as the first fire, or you can see that as Surt the Black. You can see that through a lot of different lenses. But what ultimately I'm getting across with that prayer is relating to fire as the eldest ancestor, because it's the first one out of the Gununga gap. And that's not really in the lore, right? Like, there's not unless you take the perspective of Surt the Black, and I kind of do. And I'm fine with that perspective, but I hold it as a loose perspective, because sometimes I get the eldest ancestor as Surt, but sometimes I also get the eldest ancestor as something that was burning or brought him forward. So it depends on the ritual context. But long story short is I don't define that for the kids when we make the fire prayer. The point is respect for the fire, respect for the eldest ancestor, respect for all the ancestors that have come before, and the gods of fire that produce this flame and share it with us. That fire prayer is a living myth. It is a living relationship. So that is, like, from a very, very basic level, the prayers we teach and what they teach us about how we relate. That's what I'm getting across when I make a prayer, or when I write a poem, or when we do something small like light a sacred fire. Now, we might be later on working with it for my daughter thinks every fire is a campfire, so everything requires s'mores. And sometimes what I do as part of that is, okay, if you want to give the fire an offering, you need to carefully put your hand over here where the coals aren't going to burn you. And it's about teaching her how to relate to fire on a very practical level, at the same time as mythologically, she's got, or not mythologically, but from a myth perspective, she's got all of these other things going on as she's giving a marshmallow to fire itself. And it is a living embodied connection. Yeah.
Delicious sacrifice.
Honestly, I think if we did more delicious sacrifices, more people would be involved.
It's a quote, an old, the snacrifice, as it were.
Snacrifice.
And the thing is, like, it's something that she likes, right? That I am telling her, before you have your own, go give this one to the fire. Before you take for yourself, give. So even in that very simple exchange, by putting the other first, that is an ethic of sharing that I am teaching her. So that's sorry, it's a lot of stuff I do is interconnected, and I don't get a chance to geek out about it as often.
No, I love the fact that you're geeking out. That's what we're here for. We're here for the geeking out. I did want to throw it over to Hrabnas though and talk about I love this idea of prayer as storytelling, and I want to know, Hrabnas, when you're creating, I'm sure you've created liturgy since you've had to make stuff up. Giving yourself, I've found that the biggest thing that everyone has to make up at some point. And I'm sorry to all those of you out there who have a strict reconstructionist thing. I hate to bust your bubble, but the reason why you're not finding complete prayers and liturgies is because none have survived in either in total or in any significant translatable part. We have scraps of things that we think may have been potentially a prayer or a blessing, but nothing approaching a pure liturgy. So one of the skills that we have to develop in making stuff up is making stuff up for our rituals, and the storytelling element that goes into that is critical, as Sarenth said. So I wanted to throw it to you, Hrabnas. When you're making stuff up, where do you start and how do you build that story throughout the ritual and throughout the liturgy, the prayers that you're saying?
A lot of the prayers that I use are very short, very bare bones, very descriptive of especially the gods and goddesses I use, because a lot of the material that I have, one of the goddesses that I am particularly drawn to because of my military service is Vihansa, or I've reconstructed her name back to Wihansus. There's one existing stone that was written by a Belgic Germanic veteran who came back to that part that basically just said he brought his spear and shield back and dedicated them to Vihansa. So I've based off of that context, I revere her as a goddess of not necessarily just war, but also military service. And that's a big thing. So a lot of the things that I do for my military service, like such as going out, PTing, standing duty, I have these little prayers that I've built to basically praise her at the beginning of my duty period, thank her for the end of an uneventful duty period. I actually have written for when I retire in 5 years, a military retirement ritual dedicated to Wihansus. And a lot of it building up with it. It's kind of hard because I don't have that same depth of material that we have in later period. I kind of feel like I'm kind of brushing the dust off of some of these deities, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I really like what you're talking about with the relationship that you're building with the story cycle that you're building through your own life and your own service, which I had actually talked with Josh Heath about just a little while ago about how one of the things that military people who serve often lack is the closure. And I love the story you're telling about the soldier who comes out and gives his weapons to Vihansa, almost as if like this is the end of his service. Like I'm now they're yours now. I'm no longer, they're no longer mine. They're yours. I'm not going to I'm not going to touch them. This is my sacrifice to you. I won't pick them. Almost like I'm not going to pick them up again, because it's an incredible thought that this is that this could be such an ancient ritual of homecoming and of fulfilling one's duty to the point where you say, they're yours now. I've fulfilled my duty. I've done what I did what I claimed, and these weapons are now yours. You see this even in like finds of lakes and of bogs and stuff where people just throw their weapons into the lake, and you wonder, And I wonder to myself, like, hypothetically speaking, was this the end to someone's story? Was this the end to someone's military service where they said, it's gone from me now. It is yours.
Some of those also may have been enemies' weapons that were being tossed, depending on some of the context. There was evidence of a pretty significant sacrificial cult to Nerthas,
Yes.
especially, but a few others. So it may be an end of service, but those may also be a thanks for victory. Which just tells another part of the military story. But yeah, one way or another, absolutely.
I'm deeply touched by that. What I also want to talk about was also in terms of like making stuff up. I want you guys to go back, think deep about it, and think back when you were just little baby heathens, little baby pagans, just rolling around, not knowing anything about the world. When you first started giving yourself permission to make stuff up, or was that from the beginning where you just said, "Nah, I'm just going to make stuff up. That's what's going to happen"? Because for me, it was deeply uncomfortable because I was deep into Reconstructionist methodology beforehand, and there was a very, and there still is, like I'm going to say it now, there still is a huge, I don't want to say a taboo, but this idea that you can't just make stuff up. And if you make stuff up, you certainly can't teach other people your made up stuff. Which, when did you guys give yourselves permission to A, make stuff up, and B, when did you give yourselves permission to tell other people, to teach other people, including your children, your made up stuff?
Well, I'll start. I like you when I started out, I was very much into the Reconstructionism. That lasted a few months when I was repeatedly hitting brick walls, and I was not finding ways to share this with my son. Which was it was a combination of that, and there were certain lessons that pertain to the modern world that I wanted to teach him that weren't always present. So I wrote those initial 10 stories that I've written. And I sort of wrote them in a little bit of a saga form. There is a main character called Ludebalthas, which is just a Proto-Germanic form of my son's name, who's one of the main protagonists of this saga. And from there, I just sort of wrote through, and each one of the 10 stories teaches a different lesson, whether it be to always be kind, but still keep yourself prepared for people you can't trust, or to accept others that are different in such a way that technically this book would be banned in the state of Florida. Or stories just about why we build and stay in shelters. And it's a very, every story's kind of teaches something different, but it was just lessons that I wanted to build his foundation, that I didn't necessarily want to reskin existing stories.
Yeah, thank you, Hrabnas. Sarenth, did you find yourself in a similar position where you hit a wall, or was it always just kind of like, I'm gonna make a way. That's what's gonna happen.
I think what I'm reacting to isn't. It's so much of online heathen discourse can be incredibly toxic around these things, and so what I'm reacting to is the made up part, because it almost feels
dismissive.
Not dismissive, almost too. There's a word I'm looking for, and it's on the tip of my tongue. It almost feels. Okay, so let me talk around it, and maybe I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
So when the fire prayer was made, I was in prayer with the various fire gods and ancestors in the Vatir that make that prayer up. So was I making it up or was I co-creating? For me, the we're just making things up is dismissive almost. Dismissive almost. It's not quite there, but it'll work. It's a good placeholder. So it's almost dismissive of, for me, and I can't speak for any other heathens on this, for me, the process of making a myth, of making a legend, of all of that is co-creative. So when we did our storytelling for Yule and Yuletide, that was actually something that I sat down with the Jotnar that were involved in that story, and we made that story together. They gave me the inspiration, and when I got stuck, they helped me out. Was it MUS, made up shit? You could say that, but ultimately, I don't. It feels too dismissive because it was a co-creative process with these gods.
Yeah,
and for me, so much of my life is wrapped up in this co-creative act that when I'm sitting down and I'm writing a prayer or I'm designing a ritual or what have you, if I don't have that component of co-creation, what am I doing and why? That, for me, it gets, if I don't have that co-creative process already on lock that has been there for me since the beginning, it doesn't feel right. Because if it's all coming from me and it's not coming from our shared relationship with these Ginregen, the gods, ancestors, and Vatir, I feel like it's missing the point or the soul of it.
There's a real. So are all three of us writers at some point? All three of us authors in some level, writing stuff, artists at some level. I feel like
Absolutely.
we're talking. Okay. So there's a concept that I think you're hitting on here, which is like inspiration, or this other concept of like duende, which is the idea that a spirit, that something you created didn't entirely come from you. And it's a very common thing that you hear from artists, dancers, writers, where they're saying like something at some point in the creation process takes over and you're no longer writing it, right? You feel like as if there's a part of co-creation going on between you and something else, and you might not be able to, you might be able to put your finger on it and say, oh no, I know exactly what I know what I'm co-creating with. Or you might have that phrase, that very vague duende phrase, which is like, I don't know what's possessing me to do this, but for some reason something is working through me rather than it's me working on something entirely. Is that kind of the feeling you're going for?
So with a lot of my fiction writing, a lot of it starts off as personal expression, and then somehow these characters get their own voices. When it comes to writing prayers or rituals or anything like that, so like I have a Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Sarenth Odinson, and you can sign up to have me write a prayer. So that is a situation where my duende is very well known. Like you give me a topic or you give me a name, and I am intentionally in a ritual setting talking to this Vatir, or this god or this ancestor, and I am intentionally creating a bridge through the poetry. When I'm doing fiction writing, that's where I get into more of that duende, where I don't know who this is, but I'm figuring it out as I write.
Yeah. Hrabnas, have you a similar experience?
For me, the writing these stories was very different. The very first story that I came up with out of this batch of stories is actually ended up being the last story of this part of the saga. It was one of the summer nights after we had first moved up here. I live in the middle of the woods, which is fantastic. It was just a great night sky and all that stuff. And I was kind of pointing out different constellations to my son, and I was just kind of realizing, like, okay, these are all Greek names, but how can I make this like feel unique or more personal to us? And I got to what is commonly known as Orion, and it just popped into my head that was Segafrithus and his bow. And from there, an entire story just formed around it. And then the character of Segafrithus, who's one of the two main, he's sort of he's the tragic of the two heroes of this saga. Just came into being, and the rest of the story is just built up from there.
Yeah, I think there's an element here, and Sarenth, I agree. Maybe we can't find exactly the right word, but dismissive is the one I'm landing on, of dismissing this concept of inspiration, of feeling something else take control and write the story. We also have to remember, and Hrabnas, you probably know this as well from your study of oral cultures, is that for many oral cultures and oral storytelling, a lot of it is they have tropes, they have characters that everyone kind of knows. And one of the brilliant things about oral cultures is most of the story is already in the heads of the people who are listening. They know references to this and this and this. They understand when a certain character does a certain thing, what that means for that character. Everyone has this kind of shared corpus of knowledge in their minds that helps fill in parts of that story. And that fills in some of those characters. And then the storyteller just can go. Right? Like, you are sitting there, you've got the characters, you've got a lot of stock in there, you've got the plenty of stuff in the minds of the listeners already, and you're just working. Like, you could be just, and so who knows if the Voluspa was a riff that someone's like just pulling a whole bunch of stuff together at once and just really impressing the heck out of people. If all these poems were just riffs that someone finally just said, oh yeah, I'm going to write that one down. I remember this one. I'm going to write this one down. As far as I remember it, they're just writing down riffs basically that someone's doing. Most of that stuff being in someone's head. Like, for example, I like to bring this one up, the story about Skadi and Njord, and Njord having really nice feet. Again, this is like the third time I brought this up. I have no idea why this is such a problem for me, but like Njord's feet being super nice. In my mind, I understanding oral storytelling, I'm pretty convinced that that's an inside joke, that's a joke that people listening to the story would have known he would have nice feet, and that Scotty was getting duped. But it would have been funny. So it just kind of gets into this idea of like oral cultures have a ton of backstory in the listener's head already, and you're just, in a sense, you're just using inspiration and making it up. And the stories that we have now, at some point, guys, they were made up.
Right. Yeah. I don't feel any insecurity over that, and I find it very telling when people are saying, "Well, we can't just make all of this up." And it's like, my guy, after a certain point, you don't have a choice unless you want to pretend that Odin came from Troy.
One thing that you were bringing up, then, well, you were mentioning there just being certain tropes that oral cultures, especially cultures that share a deep ancestry, such as like the Indo-European cultures or the Afro-Semitic. I think Afro-Semitic is still the term, but I think there's a newer term they use for it. But like a lot of those proto-cultures sort of share in their stories. And a lot of the study I did in college was originally early Bronze Age. I was very interested in the Elamites and the Levant and everything. And the two main heroes of my saga do kind of give off a little bit of Gilgamesh and Enkidu vibes. To a degree, I think there's just these tropes from these classic stories that are just so foundational from a literary sense that we just gravitate towards them. And them being foundational from a literary sense came from somewhere even earlier than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the original. I mean, the Enkidu and Gilgamesh story just manifests again as Lethal Weapon 1, 2, and 3. You have it's the original buddy cop. movie.
Yeah, kind of.
I
can see that.
Oh my gosh,
God.
I never thought of it that way, but it's so corrected.
I mean,
Oh my god,
is Murtaugh not Gilgamesh?
Wow.
Is Riggs not Enkidu?
Oh God, I'm never gonna be able to unsee
Right?
that. Thanks.
You're never gonna see it the same way again.
I'll never unsee that.
Wow.
It's just a retelling of Gilgamesh. But the
man, thanks. That's in my head now.
Yeah, that's gonna get everywhere. And I also think that this idea, this is why I don't like the term UPG. I actually dislike it deeply because it oversimplifies a ton of different stuff that we do to negotiate our faith in the modern world. It's you have things like deduction, where you're putting together different pieces of myth or a practice to form something else. Induction, where you're reading a whole bunch of stuff and deriving a conclusion from it. You have synthesis, where you have two different ideas that don't make a lot of sense together, and you somehow find a gestalt that makes it make sense. And you have inspiration, which is just when stuff. It's that experience of you don't know where this came from, you don't quite know where it came from, but it's there and it feels right.
I think for me, talking about gnosis and UPG as terms is a whole other conversation into itself that I can go on for a long time. I'm going to put aside my knee jerk on that and just state that I get why we started using those terms, because discernment was not as heavily practiced. But now that we have much better sourcing, the academic sources are much more readily available and translated. We are living in the golden age of information. Truly, when you get right down to it, yeah, even if you don't have a JSTOR access, a lot of really excellent, well-researched and developed information is out there for free at point of source. For instance, Magic in the Pre-Modern North, which was an excellent conference that I've gone to several times, where you can sign up and you can listen to all of these PhDs and PhD candidates and folks who are just like really deep in this stuff talk at length on their research topic. And it's kind of like how we used to have what used to be called penny universities with the coffee houses and stuff. It's very much in that vein of I get to sit in and listen to a lecture for literally, in the case of the conference that I just mentioned, like 2 or 3 days. It's fascinating stuff. And it gives you such a wellspring of information to draw from that you can bring that inspiration together with deduction, induction, synthesis, and gestalt. And these things aren't contradictory because where a lot of that metal meets the meat, right? Like our foot is hitting the gas here. It has to be relevant to who and what we are. And bringing this back to our kids, how we take in this information and synthesize it and then digest it and give it to them is a process that I really invite folks to think about, like think deeply about, because you are literally training up the next generation in how to think. And that is such a powerful responsibility. I mean, I'm saying this as an Odinson who, you know, Othin will go to the ends of the earth and back again for a scrap of knowledge. And the setting up of the next generation with these stories and right relationship and relationship to self is so powerful because you are teaching them the tropes that guide their life. You're becoming a living ancestor and you are becoming the lessons you leave behind. This stuff is not just, oh, let's entertain the kids. It's, at least the way that I approach this, is a solemn duty to tell these stories well for whatever the subject is. Even if it is to entertain, there's some kind of point to it. That you can have your cake and eat it too in this case. And you should, in my view.
Yeah.
And so please go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, since we are talking about stories, and you kind of bring up some stuff about it being to entertain the kids, but also to teach them that lesson, to tell it well. If you guys would be okay with me sharing one of the shorter stories, just as an example of one of the stories that I tell my son, and actually one of the most important ones when it comes to acceptance, both acceptance of people and hearth culture.
I'm good with it.
Within my practice.
Yeah, if you can fit it in 5 minutes, it'd be great.
Oh, this is literally a 2.5-page story.
Okay.
They're all small ones because it entertains a 6 to 7 year old.
Awesome. Hit it.
Amongst the Widafolka lived Oderiks and Hameriks, 2 brave men and skilled hunters who were always found together. Neither man took any wife, and neither man sired any children. The other Widafolka spoke about them in whispered words, but never approached them. Oderiks and Hameriks grew older and built their own husa, apart from the other huso, and kept to themselves, mindful of the whispered words about them. Oderiks and Hameriks came to hunt for the Widafolka, as the other hunters did. Oderiks and Hameriks came to plant the seeds with the Widafolka, as the other tribespeople did. Oderiks and Hameriks came and sang the songs and told the stories, as the other Widafolka did, and prayed to Wodnas, just as the other Widafolka did. But always they returned to their husa alone, surrounded by the whispered words. One night when the winds were cold, a fire escaped the hearth in one of the husa, and the Widafolka inside had to flee with what few belongings they could carry. The Widafolka lamented, "Whatever shall we do? The night is cold, and all we have has been lost." They made their way past the husa of Oderiks and Hameriks, and went to the husa of Ludabolthas, and begged that he help them. Ludaboltha had seen them pass by the husa of Oderiks and Hameriks, and he said to them, "I have no room for you. Go to another's husa." The Widafolka made their way to the husa of Sigafrithas, again passing by the husa of Oderiks and Hameriks. Sigafrithas had seen them pass by the husa of Oderiks and Hameriks, and he said to them, "I have no room for you. Go to another's husa." The Widafolka lamented, "But where shall we go? We have no place that shall shelter us." Sigafrithas replied, "Have you not asked of Oderiks and Hameriks?" The Widafolka recoiled, "But they are strange men with strange ways." Sigafrithas burst out with a great fury. "When have they ever failed to come and hunt with the Widafolka? When have they ever failed to come and plant with the Widafolka? When have they ever failed to carry on the songs and stories of the Widafolka? They have never failed to be men of our tribe, while you have done nothing but whispered evil words about them." The Widafolka, shamed by Sigafrithas' words, went to the husa of Oderiks and Hameriks to beg shelter. Oderiks and Hameriks welcomed them in and shared their hearth and shelter, and shared their food and drink.
Awesome story. I liked it very much, and I even played a little bit of acoustic ambiance in the background for you.
I was loving that.
Love that. That's a really good example of that. I like the kind of applying old school storytelling techniques, the rule of threes, even though I kind of sit there and I go, "Oh, I see what you're doing." The structure, it flowed so well, and I'm so glad you shared that with us. I did want to, so we are running short of time. I just want to get one last thing in as we promised, and I do, and you know what, you guys can chime in too on this, because this actually does have to do with stories that we tell. And so just to remind everybody, here was the question that came up. Ben, I recently made a video about the Delphi case where I cited your channel. What are your thoughts about your faith being hijacked by people promoting racist ideology? So there's a lot of ways to frame this story, and we certainly could frame it as being a hijack by racists of the religion, and that's certainly the way that some people frame the story. And I don't know how you guys feel about it. For me, I look at it a little differently. I see that this religion got its start. Its start in a lot of different other movements. in a different kind of in a similar stew, let's say, to some really awful movements. So, like, for example, I would say like the Romantic Nationalist movement of the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, Arianosophy, and those current and the back to nature movement, the idea of a religion being natural to a people, those kinds of ideas were part of the soup, the stew out of which early, Odinist, Ásatrú movements arose. But they arose really differently all around the world. And one of the things I like to say about the American story in particular, so some of these stories don't really involve like necessarily a hijacking, but the American story starts for me starts in that nationalism, that really painful stuff, but it actually changes, and I think we need to emphasize this more and more as heathens, as modern heathens, the story we tell, because it is true. It changes because of the people that were initially marginalized. It changes because heathenry changed because of women who were told that they could not, that they were lesser, that they were just vessels to carry on the next generation. It changed because of LGBTQ people who who contributed tons of scholarship. Wrote, I think it was Kveldolf Gunderson rewrote our Troth, which popularized heathenry to thousands of people. You have women like Patty LaFile. You have BIPOC people, all people who were marginalized, who came in and changed this faith for the better. And actually, part of the reason we have inclusive heathenry today, and I would say the main driving force behind it, is LGBTQ, BIPOC people, women, people who were pushed aside, marginalized, no longer accepting their marginalized status, and fighting back and taking this religion back. And it's for us, the cis people, for me, to get on board, to get on the train. That's what it is. So if the notion that there's a lot of different complications with regards to like Odinism in prison, how it started, how it still manifests to this day. But to me, the story of inclusive heathenry is the story of people that were pushed to the margins, taking back and reminding people of the essential moral and ethical core of our faith and what we are really all about. That's for me. I don't know about, what do you guys think about that particular story, or is there other ways that you guys think about it?
Well, you hit on the 19th century point, which is something I was going to bring up. I would not say some of that ideology is the foundation of heathenry, but it was amongst the many stones that are the scholarly foundation. There was, in the scope of 19th century, unfortunately, some of those people who are quite frankly a-holes did some good scholarship to build up to where we are now. We have to acknowledge that was a part of it, but it's we can't let it continue to be a defining factor of what it is. Like you were saying, it is the BIPOC community, the LGBTQIA plus community that has. I mean, you took pretty much all the points I would have brought up that are absolutely it. I just have to go back and just highlight that and kind of reemphasize that's you're absolutely right, and that's just kind of where we are.
Yeah, I like to phrase it as there's some people who say like, well, they brought their politics into heathenry and ruined it, and I said no, they saved it. They saved it. Otherwise, without them, without the sacrifice that they made, without them constantly pushing their efforts, their time, their energy, the tears, the blood, the sacrifice they made to assert themselves, we would not have what we have today. Most of us, some of us wouldn't even be here because we wouldn't get involved in heathenry, because it would just be a white nationalist group with some pagan trappings on it. It's because of them that we have what we have.
Yeah. The only reason that I am here in the first place, because every heathen I ran into when I first became a pagan was white nationalist blood and soil, like almost to a T. The only reason that I am here is because of the diligent work that people have done to make this an inclusive space. And not only do I benefit from all of that hard work and all of that dedication, but I also really want to emphasize that it is not my faith. At a certain point, it's not my faith being hijacked. It is heathenry is being used as a tool. Yeah. It is heathenry is being used as cover, as a political tool, rather than the other way around. I think that when we analyze how heathen stories, heathen identities, and heathen communities are used as a shield by white supremacists, by people who are very often not actually involved in our religion, but are tangentially, they might have the trappings, they might have a symbol, whether it's the Algis or Mother rune, or Tiwa's rune, or the Valknut, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. They may have the trappings, but they're not actually in community with us. And I'm not saying this is a no true Scotsman defense. I am saying this as, if you cannot differentiate my community from the trappings that these people are taking, that's a me problem, and that we have more work to do. But they're not actually hijacking my faith. What they're doing is they're hijacking my symbols, and these are different things. And I'm being very exacting because the average person who hijacks the symbols doesn't understand the stories. And this is why telling the stories is so important. This is why being a living embodiment of these stories is so important. Because if you're a living embodiment and you're an inclusive heathen, and you are embodying these stories, and you are literally sometimes embodying these symbols. I wear these because I work in an environment where it would be really easy for racists and white supremacists to control the narrative by wearing these. Being an inclusive person and being out the way I am in pretty much all aspects of my life at this point, yeah, like these are sacred to me, and I live my life in a way that honors these symbols. And so part of my portion with the people that will try to take my symbols and twist them, that will try to hurt my communities through misrepresentation, and for those communities that are heathen and are white supremacist, this is also why we need to stand up and be very loud, because as many inclusive heathens as we do have among our ranks, and they are, in my view, the majority, the problem is that these guys have bullhorns. And so some speaking up and some living representations have to be here. So part of my work is to be that living story that other people get touched by. And so when it comes to people promoting racist and fascist ideology, you know, short of actions that I can't take, what is my portion to do? My portion is to be a living story that other people can look to.
Love it.
And one thing that I think is just good with the theme we're covering today is, also along with stories not just being for children, but for being part of our living faith as it is.
You got me. You got my real intention.
Writing and creating these stories, such as the story that I read, and I have some others along that same vein, are part of it, to show that this is inclusive. We are teaching inclusivity, and quite frankly, those racist ideologies are the minority, and we just have, while they may have the bullhorns, we we are more and more consistently getting bullhorns of our own and getting to the point where it's not an easy task, but eventually
Well, we're telling the better story at the end of the day.
Yes.
Like
Absolutely.
we're teaching the better stories. We're living the better stories. So I think that we've got it on our side, and it's a matter of continuing to tell those stories and not losing heart.
Yes, exactly. I
Absolutely.
thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Again, the part you revealed part of my dark intention that this wasn't just about children's stories. My dark and devious intention to make it about the stories that we tell in general. And yes, inclusive stories are better. They prepare our children better for the world that they are going to someday inherit from us. By the will of the gods, it will be an inclusive world, a more inclusive world than the one even we grew up in. And we will strive every day to make that happen. No heathenry, but inclusive heathenry. That's right. So thank you guys so much. I want to thank Hrabnas, Sarenth. Thank you so much for staying a little bit extra to answer that question, and we appreciate you guys going out telling those stories. And we want to invite you out there to go out and make your own stories and have that impact. Did you guys have any kind of parting thoughts for the audience this evening?
Just if you have an idea for a story that it just comes to you, even if it's rough, write it down. You don't know what may be inspiring you, what may be creating it, but create those stories and just it'll help somebody else in building their faith.
I think if I was to leave folks with one thing, the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we share with each other, the stories that form our lives are really foundational to how things are going to unfold. Because it's the foundation and everything to how we live our lives. So whether you're making a just so story for your kids, or whether you're teaching them a creation story, or whether you're teaching them a piece of myth or something that the gods just kind of dropped in your lap and now it's yours to share, please share it. There's no reason not to, because that is your portion to share.
Love it. All right, guys. Well, from all of us to all of you, no heathenry, but inclusive heathenry. And, get on the train or get out of the way. That's all I'm saying. All right, folks. Have a great night.